were together. And, and the more I thought about the Middle Ages, and, that's the time of the knights and everything, um, I had a question that kept coming up that I feel like I have to share it with you folks, because I don't know if we ever found out what the knights in white sat in. Now, some of you will get this, and some of you will not. So, so I see, okay, yeah, I know. It's kind of like, okay. Okay. I got to get your attention somehow, So, okay, and now that I've got everyone's attention, and I don't make light of the subject, but I got to keep you on your toes, right? We're talking about the Reformation tonight and anti-Semitism. And down at the bottom of the screen, those are Paul's dates. If you want technical dates, 1517, that's when Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, and when it kind of subsided or whatever, do your research. I'm just giving you a broad category: early 1500s to late 1600s. That's close enough to be the Reformation. And because we're talking about the subject of anti-Semitism, I couldn't help but put this next slide together because I think it's important for us to remember. 80 years yesterday was the liberation of Auschwitz. Okay, now everyone in this room should know what Auschwitz is. Okay, if not, next week you'll find out. Okay, but 80 years ago yesterday is when the United States, as well as Britain, liberated several of the death camps, and the most notorious, of course, was Auschwitz.
It was the Russians that liberated Auschwitz.
Oh, was it? Because pictures I have show Americans there. So, but so the thing of it is, you need to be aware of that. This is anti-Semitism at its height. And we'll get into that next week. We'll be talking about that next week. And I've been telling you almost on a weekly basis about resources. And I keep telling you because I think some of you probably want to go a little bit deeper in your study than, and honestly, you may think, boy, this thing's lasting forever. We're only skimming the surface of this whole subject. We really are. There's so much information. There's so much that I have to leave out for time's sake. And that's why I recommend, and I continue recommending, Olivier Melnick's ministry down at the bottom of the screen there. The book End Time Anti-Semitism is a book that I'm using as one of my main references. I would suggest, if you're interested in going deeper, then pick up that book. Or there's another book that I've also been showing you folks the last couple of weeks by Dr. David Reagan. Dr. David Reagan. He's the man in the center of the photo. Those two people on the right kind of photobombed him, But anyways, he wrote the book, The Jewish People. Again, a great resource for this subject. Jane and I were privileged to meet him last year at a prophecy conference over in Sugarland, Texas. And he's a great fella. I mean, he spoke on anti-Semitism at this conference. Olivier Melnick was at that conference. He spoke multiple times because that's his ministry. But anyways, those are two, I think, valuable resources that, if I could put them in all your hands, I would. But anyways, last week we were in the Middle Ages, around 500 AD to about 1500 AD. Melnick says in one of his books, anti-Judaism in theory became anti-Semitism in practice during the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages. And if you remember last week, we spent the whole class looking at a lot of these bullet points that are up on the board. If you weren't here, I would suggest you go to the YouTube channel and watch last week's class. One thing I want to just very briefly talk about is the two codes at the top. There's a fellow in our Tuesday night Bible study that loves to do research. So I'm giving my friend Joel his 15 minutes of fame. Okay? He sent me because he watches the videos like after they're posted, but he sent me a text today talking about those codes, and I just want to read. It's just a little paragraph that he sent me. He says it seems that after Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD, a series of laws were implemented over time against the Jews. Now, it's not up here, but in 313, the Edict of what? Milan. The Edict of Milan basically legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. Okay, so Constantine, that was one of the first things he did. It goes on. He goes on. He says, for example, in 404, this is anti-Semitism now. In 404, Jews were excluded from certain jobs in the government. This is the Roman Empire now. In 418, they were barred from civil service and from military positions. In 425, they were excluded from any of the remaining public jobs that were out there. The Theodosian Code in 438 AD included a compilation of all these previous laws, and I might add a lot more that were anti-Semitic in their tone. And Joe goes on and says that as your PowerPoint slide indicated, the Justinian Code in 529 replaced the Theodosian Code, and the Justinian Code is actually just picked up where the other one left off. And they continued to add, because you have to remember, I brought this up last week, the church is now, for lack of a better term, they're in bed with the Roman government. And by 529 AD, the Roman Empire is pretty much going away, and the church is the power source in will become throughout Europe. Okay, so that's just something. I know I just kind of passed over those quickly because we needed to get to these other items that are up there on the list. So that's from last week's class. Okay, about the Reformation and anti-Semitism. A couple notes that I've put up here. All the early reformers. Now, remember, we're in the time of Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli. All those are the reformers. Okay, the majority of them were ex-Catholics. They were ex-Catholics, and many of them were former Catholic priests. Okay, although they corrected the doctrine of salvation, which they did, they made salvation according to the scriptures, by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. Okay, that was one of the mottos of the Reformation. Okay, it took away the Catholic version of salvation, which was a salvation of works, and they brought it down to as simple as Ephesians 2:8-9 or John 3:16. The reformers, the vast majority of them, held on to what's known as Augustinian theology. The replacement theology is kind of the core of Augustine or Augustine, again, depending on where you're from. You can pronounce it either way. Okay. Replacement theology, and that's my little definition up there. It's the belief that the church has replaced Israel in God's plan. The Jews now are out of the picture, period. They're done away with. Okay? That's the center of most Reformed teaching during this time of the Reformation. That's kind of where they're at. Okay, and along with this teaching on of course, replacement theology is just a portion of it, but along with Augustine's theology comes the idea of anti-Semitism. It's continuing to grow, and it's becoming even more abusive than it was. And that's kind of where the reformers are at, and you're going to see that tonight as we go through and look at the two, what I call the two biggies in the Reformation, Luther and Calvin. If you are interested, another resource for you, if you are interested, by Dr. Andy Woods. He talks in this, it's a small book, it's only maybe 180 pages, something like that. He talks about what the reformers missed. So, a lot of people hold the reformers up as, almost like the second coming. Okay. And in a lot of ways, they did a lot of great things. Woods brings that out in his books, but they missed a lot. They failed in a lot of ways. And that's kind of what he's trying to balance out here, is that we need to look at the reformers as who they were. They were humans, and they were governed by their theology. And if their theology goes all the ways back to Augustine, when did Augustine live? Early 400s. We're now in the mid 1500s. And what the reformers have done is they've dragged Augustinian theology into the Reformation. You'll see that in a lot of their writings. You'll see that in some of the things that I'm going to be putting up on the screen tonight. Questions, comments so far? Dramatic pause for a drink. Okay. Remember last week I talked about Luther? And, Luther was a Catholic priest. He was ordained in 1507. And if you recall, I brought Luther up because, remember, we talked about something that the Jews were accused of doing called host desecration. I don't know if you remember that or not, but host desecration, this is what they were accused of. There's no evidence for this. It was rumor that became truth, that became a death sentence for a lot of Jews during this time. But host desecration is that they were accused of, now the host is something that the Catholic priest holds up during the Mass. Okay. If any of you are ex-Catholics, you know what I'm talking about. They hold up the host. What the Jews were accused of doing was taking those hosts and stabbing them with a dagger. And by that, they would curse Christ and supposedly put him to death again. Because part of Catholic theology, now listen to this, okay? Went over this last week, but I'm reminding you, part of Catholic theology is they believe when the priest raises the host or he raises the chalice, that at that point in time, the actual body and blood, the flesh of Christ, takes over that host, takes over that chalice that has wine in it. And this is called transubstantiation. That's the big long term that's used, and that's what they believe, that the host becomes the body of Christ, which the priest takes that host and breaks it. Okay, I'm an ex-Catholic, so I know I've watched this every Mass that I went to. Okay, they break that host. That indicates that they are sacrificing Christ again. And then they would drink the blood, supposedly from the chalice. And that's part of the Mass. That's part of the ritual of the Mass. Okay, that's Catholic theology. Okay. Anyways, since we talked about Luther, I just thought I'd bring this up. During his first Mass that he conducted, he was basically, overcome by the idea that he was actually bringing Christ down to earth to be sacrificed again. He actually froze up at the what do you call it? Um, altar. Easy enough. How come I only have one person say that at the altar? That's too easy. That's too easy. Yeah, at the altar. What? What? Oh boy. We just got started. My mind's blank already. When Luther was up at the altar and he was performing this, there's actually a senior priest that helps the young priest the first time he goes through this. He had to kind of take over because Luther didn't know. He was overcome by the fact that through the power of the priesthood, he was changing. Understand this. He was changing that host and that wafer and that wine into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. He now had the power to do that through the priesthood. Okay, that's part of becoming a priest. That's part of Catholic theology. Okay, just something that I thought I'd go back to tonight because this is something that ties in with the host desecration that we talked about last week. Okay. Anyways, a lot of Jews lost their lives because they were accused of sticking daggers into the host and supposedly killing Christ again. That's what they were accused of. Okay. So, let me mention something else by Dr. Woods, as long as we're on the subject here, and because I'm using a lot of his slides tonight. Okay, he's doing a teaching right now called Neo-Calvinism versus the Bible. He's about halfway through his teaching. I've been watching it since the beginning, and during the first, I can't remember which number it is, but fourth or fifth lesson that he did, he talked about Calvin and anti-Semitism. And what he showed is, and you're going to see it tonight because I was able to get a lot of his slides, because one thing that Sugarland Bible Church does is they put all of Dr. Wood's slides up on the internet for anyone. If you want to download them, you can download them. Okay. Now I take advantage of that. Anyways, I downloaded a lot of his slides on quotes from Calvin, which we're going to be looking at here in just a few minutes. Okay. But anyways, if you're interested in the subject of Calvinism, by the way, this is a great study. It's not something that you're gonna, over in 15 minutes. He goes for an hour in Sunday school, and he teaches thoroughly. Everything that I've observed in his teaching, I agree with 100%. Okay, I don't usually get a chance to say that, but 4 or 5 years ago, I taught on this subject. And everything I taught on, he's basically echoing. So I don't know if he got a hold of my notes, I'm just gonna have to have a talk with him about that. But honestly, I mean, it's spot on as far as I'm concerned on the subject of Calvinism. This is I don't want to chase rabbits, okay, because it's easy for me to do that. Believe it or not, this is a big problem in the Southern Baptist Convention. It's a huge problem in the Southern Baptist Convention. Okay, whether you're aware of it or not, or whether you care or not. Okay, all of our seminaries are now Calvinistic Reformed. Okay, all of them. Okay, Western was the last holdout over in Fort Worth, Texas. But after they lost their president, basically the Reformed folks took over, and now all of the Southern Baptist seminaries are Reformed in their teaching, which means they're Calvinistic in their teaching. Okay, which is something to keep in mind. Okay, I know I'm going off a little here, but keep this in mind. Someday our pastor is going to step down. Someday maybe the Lord's going to take him home, and where are the elders, where's the church going to look for the next pastor of this church? Well, the best place to look is for seminary graduates. So we need to be very careful because, and this is, I've had this talk with Eddie, so don't think he doesn't. Eddie and I are in lockstep on this subject. Okay, one of the things that we need to be careful of is, someone could come into this church and be a Calvinist, be Reformed. So the vetting process that takes place when there's a new pastor coming in has to be very precise. Has to be very precise. Okay. I know off subject here. I apologize, but it's just something that's always on my mind. It's always on my mind. Okay. Okay. Enough of that. I'll save the rest of it for my next sermon. Okay. Um, Europe is coming out of the Middle Ages. And as they come out of the Middle Ages, some call it the Dark Ages, the Reformation takes place, and the Reformation is going to challenge the Catholic Church. They're going to challenge the Catholic Church. So in 1517, most of you folks that have sat under my teaching for any length of time know, come October, I spend at least one class talking about Martin Luther. Okay, he's the one that started the Reformation by my accord. Okay, that's the way I feel. Okay, so in 1517 he posts the 95 Theses. The church is at the verge of beginning to split. Okay, it's going to fracture, and by the mid 1500s, we're going to have a total split in the church, because there's only one church at this time, the Catholic Church. Okay. That's going to change in just a matter of years. At the beginning of his ministry, Luther writes a pamphlet called "Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew," and he is extremely positive about the Jews and about what they have done and their all that they've how the world has been blessed through them. It's a short panel. I think you can even go online and download it if you want to. Okay, it's very positive. As a matter of fact, he comes down on the church saying that the church has made it hard for Jews to become part of the church because of the way that they've ostracized the Jews and have committed acts against the Jews for decades, centuries, actually. Okay, so at the beginning of his ministry, at the beginning of the Reformation, Martin Luther is extremely positive about the Jews. Okay, he wants to bring them into the church. He wants to bring them in the church. Okay, a couple years go by, like 10, 15, 20, and it doesn't take long where that optimism is going to change, and change big time. Okay, Luther changes his take on the Jews because they are not converting in mass. Even though the gospel has been rescued from the Catholic Church, they are not responding the way Luther believes they should. In 1543, not long before he dies, okay, now he produces another pamphlet. Look at the name of this one: Concerning the Jews and Their Lies. Concerning the Jews and their lies. And what I'm going to do is show you just some excerpts from that pamphlet. Okay, this is Martin Luther later in life. Again, you have to see the whole picture. You have to see the whole picture. At the beginning, he's, actually from what I understand from history, there were Jewish rabbis that actually helped Luther in his understanding of Hebrew. So, he had a relation with them. But now, they're still staying Jews. They're still staying Jews. So what does Luther do? He produces this pamphlet that spreads like wildfire. Spreads like wildfire. These are some of his quotes from that pamphlet. He says, first, their synagogues should be set on fire. Second, their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed. Third, they should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmuds. That's their commentaries on the scriptures. Okay. Well, how do you really feel, Martin? Well, let me go on. Fourth, their rabbis must be forbidden under the threat of death to teach anymore. Now, imagine that. Imagine if the government was in such a state where they would tell, our pastor, you stand up in that pulpit and teach, we're going to take you out in the parking lot and we're going to shoot you and kill you. That's basically what Luther wanted done to the rabbis that were teaching. Okay. They should be forbidden under threat of death. Fifth, passports and traveling privileges should be absolutely forbidden to the Jews. Sixth, they ought to be stopped from usury. Okay, that's the idea of charging interest on loans, correct? Okay, that's the idea of, so what do? You lend a person $100 and you're looking for a return on your money. Well, if you're a Jew, you're not getting any return on your money, according to what Luther wants to do. Okay, can you believe this?
That's why they didn't just have, mass coming to Christ. These people are.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Well, it's kind of the same problem a lot of churches have today. It's the way things are taught and spoken about, and it's the one, it's like, is this really going to draw people to you, or is it gonna
push them further away? Push them further away. Luther is isolating the Jews. Isolating the Jews. He goes on. Yeah, it gets worse. Let the young and strong Jews and Jewesses be given the flail, the axe, the hoe, the spade, the distaff, the spindle, and let them earn their bread by the sweat of their noses. We ought to drive the rascally, lazy bones out of our system. Okay, this is Martin Luther. This is Martin Luther. Okay, these are his writings. It's when you speak, there are things that you say, and I know this because if I go back and watch this teaching, sometime later this week, usually I'll look at it and I'll watch it and I'll say, I can't believe I said that. Because when you're in the heat of the moment, when you're teaching, sometimes you say things out of context or whatever. But something changes when you sit down and you write something. When you sit down and write something, you are thinking about every word, every punctuation that you're using, every thought that you're putting on paper. This is Luther's thoughts. These are his deepest thoughts. He goes on, and this is just, like I said, this is just some highlights. I can't even call them highlights, can we? Therefore, away with them. To sum up, dear princes and nobles who have Jews in your domains, if this advice of mine does not suit you, then find a better one so that you and we, notice, may all be free of this insufferable, devilish burden, the Jews. Okay, Martin Luther. Martin Luther. Sad, isn't it?
Do you think he was mentally stable when he wrote that?
I think he thought every word out. I really do. That's my thought. Because if you look at some of the theology that he wrote, it's concise. It's beautiful. Okay, I mean, this is a man. Yeah, he's in his latter years, but I think he's still thinking clearly, and I think at this point in his life, he is so against the Jews that he's writing things that basically he wants the land, we're talking Germany at this time, he wants the land rid of them. He wants the land rid of them.
so passionate about this desire of the outcome that he didn't get? Instead of saying, well, then, okay, what do we do next? He becomes very bitter about not getting that out.
Yeah. Instead of changing the strategy, about how to approach the Jews or how to win them to Christ, he comes out with all this anti-Semitic dribble. Okay. The Encyclopedia Judaica says this in their article on Martin Luther: short of the Auschwitz oven and the extermination, the whole Nazi Holocaust is pre-outlined here. Read that last. The whole Nazi Holocaust is pre-outlined here. Okay. And guess who's going to pick up on this? Okay. And we'll find out a lot more next week. But Olivier Melnick, in his book on end-time Semitism, says this. He kind of wraps things up like this. In 1543, when the Jewish community didn't meet his expectations, Luther published the book of the Jews and Their Lives, where his description of the Jewish people is so venomous that Hitler was quoted saying that he was just finishing up what Luther started. Okay. Those are words from Adolf Hitler. Those are his words. Okay. As a matter of fact, many scholars and historians believe that Luther's views of the Jews had a profound effect on Germans for centuries, on Germans for centuries to come, and also had a serious influence on Hitler's ideology in implementing the final solution to the Jewish question. The connection between Luther and Hitler is not difficult to make. That's how bad this writing is of Martin Luther. Okay, one of the reformers, someone that I teach on almost every year, but I always make a point of saying I'm talking about early Luther. Well, this October, I think we might change and talk about the later Luther, because I think we need to see the balance. We need to see the balance. This is Luther where he's just unplugged, okay, for lack of a better term. Okay, he's just coming at the Jews and he's saying anything that needs to be done to get them out of the land needs to be done, whatever that might be. And Hitler's going to take those words and he will come up with a way to eliminate the Jews in a permanent way. Okay, questions, comments? Let's talk about another hero of the Reformation, John Calvin. John Calvin, he doesn't want to be outdone, of course. So he's going to develop his own unique form of anti-Semitism. And again, Calvin, I think almost more than, although Luther embraces Augustine's theology, John Calvin really, I mean, he was almost word for word, Calvin and Augustine. Okay, Augustine, you can see when he lived at that time frame, the early 400s. Okay, he is the father of Catholic theology, and now we have not just this Protestant, John Calvin, but we have just about all Protestants will start following the teachings of Augustine. Okay, because they think that he had it all together. Yeah, he maybe some of the Catholic things we can do away with, but we'll keep a lot of it. Okay. We're going to look at some of his quotes here. And I know, we're looking at quotes tonight. This may or may not be your cup of tea, but you need to understand the thinking of the Reformation leaders. And we're only looking at two of them. Okay. We've talked about replacement theology for weeks now. Okay. Keep that in mind as we look at some of these quotes from Calvin. And I believe you're going to see that replacement theology comes through. Remember, it's the idea that the church is going to replace Israel. The church is going to replace the Jews. Okay, the church gets all the blessings, the Jews get all the curses. That's the way it works out in replacement theology. Okay. So, John Calvin. But here he's talking about a rabbi now. He not only betrays his ignorance, but his utter stupidity, since God so blinded the whole people. That's all the Jews now, okay? All the Jews have been blinded that they were like recitative dogs. Now, this is Old English. I had to look up what recitative is. If you know what it is, more power to you. I had to look it up. So from the American Heritage Dictionary, a recitative means to refusing to move, hard to control, impatient, or an absence of calm. Okay, that's how he felt about the Jews. I am so excited I'm losing my voice. I have had a need for a drink is what I need. I have had much conversation with many Jews. I have never seen either a drop of piety or a grain of truth or ingenuousness. Nay, I have never found common sense in any Jew. In any Jew. Okay. Calvin goes on. But by this public call, the Gentiles were not only made equal to the Jews, but seemed to be substituted into their place, as if the Jews had been dead. Okay, that's basically how the reformers, with their anti-Semitic mindset, looked at the Jews. They were basically dead. They were alive physically, but they're dead spiritually, and they'll never be. They'll never be part of the church. Okay, they'll never be part of the church. In one of his sermons, Calvin declares this: "Now the Jews are cut off like rotten limbs. We, that's the church, have taken their place." Notice how the church is always in such a positive light, always in a positive light. Read any of the reformers you want to. The church is always presented in very positive aspect. But the Jews, they're like rotten limbs. They need to be cut off. They need to be cut off. Calvin also declares them, that's the Jews, to be cut off from everything, adding hauntingly, and we, that's the church again, have succeeded them in their place. Again, this is replacement theology. Okay, the church now replaces Israel. Israel is now off the map. Okay, God has nothing to do with them anymore. It's only the church. It's only the church. Last quote. Calvin repeatedly refers to the Jews as profane, unholy, sacrilegious dogs, describing them as a barbarous nation and the people of Israel rejected by God. All from Calvin's writings. So they're all from Calvin's writings. A lot of it is in his Institutes of the Christian Faith. Others are from sermons and such that have been pieced together. Okay, but can you see what's going on? Now we're in the Reformation. We're in the 1500s, and the church is dividing. You have the Catholic Church that is anti-Semitic, and now you have the Protestant Church, and guess what they are? Anti-Semitic also. Okay, they're anti-Semitic also. So where are the Jews supposed to go? Where are they supposed to go? What are they supposed to do? In wrapping up the Reformation, Olivier Melnick says in his End Times Anti-Semitism, he has this quote, and I'm gonna want to share. In France, in England, and then I added actually throughout Europe, in spite of expulsions, anti-Semitism continued to flourish. In the words of historian Leon somebody or other, where the Jews did not exist, he was invented. Where the Jew did not exist, he was invented. So some of the things we talked about last week that can't be proven, host desecration, the blood libel thing that we talked about, it can't be proven. So we'll make it up. It's the Jews. It's the Jews. They're the ones. They're the ones. In other words, it didn't matter if Jewish people were guilty or if people had even met a Jewish person in their lives. Jewish people were becoming guilty of the ills of the world simply by virtue of being what? Of being Jews. Of being Jews. You'll see this next week in spades when we talk about modern anti-Semitism. It gets uglier as the years go, and we're skipping, centuries here as we move along in this study. Okay, David Reagan sums up his section on the Reformation just by stating this. Unfortunately, the Reformation produced no changes in attitudes toward the Jews. Replacement theology is contained throughout the reference notes of the Geneva Bible published in 1557. The Geneva Bible was the Reformed Bible. Okay, it was the Reformed Bible. Okay, but hey, the rest of us are here also. And it's also reflected in the chapter headings of the King James Bible that was published in 1611. So you couldn't get away from it. As a Protestant, you were going to be bombarded with this whole idea of either replacement theology and that the Jews had to be replaced. That's what they did. The terrible truth that Christians do not like to face, in which many are unaware, and I really need to underline that, many are unaware, is that the Holocaust was the product of 1900 years of poisonous Christian anti-Semitism. It didn't happen overnight. Everyone, we all want to kind of place our focus on Hitler and Hitler's Germany. We'll see that next week, and how bad, how evil they were, and boy, they were. They came up with the final solution, and if it would have continued, who knows how many more millions would have been killed. Okay, but we need to kind of take the blinders off. This didn't happen in the 1930s and the 1940s. This happened in 100 AD and following. As the church began to come into power, anti-Semitism grew, and it grew exponentially. I mean, it just took off. There were times where it wasn't as bad as others, but it never stopped. It has never stopped, and it will never stop. Right? I mean, we'll talk about end time anti-Semitism, which is going to be, from people that I've read, and when you talk about what's going to be taking place during the tribulation period, the Holocaust is like a cakewalk. Okay, I mean, I'm not trying to be facetious here, but 2/3. Think of that. 2/3 of the Jews on earth will be killed. Zechariah chapter 13, okay? 2/3 of the Jews that are alive during the tribulation will be killed. Right now, there are approximately 10 million Jews in Israel at this time. And from what I understand, there are somewhere around 16 million more scattered around the world, okay? Think of 2/3 of them all being killed. That's what's going to be happening as the Antichrist comes into power and he unleashes his fury against the Jews. That's coming. That's coming. Praise God, we're not going to be here to witness it. It's something that I'm very strong about. Okay, we're not going to be here to witness this, but the Jews will be. The Jews will be. Okay. And until they say the end of Matthew chapter 23, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Until the Jewish nation says that, they're going to continue to be persecuted and hunted down and killed. Okay, that's the um, the the strategy of Satan in the end time. That's going to happen. Okay. Wish I could end on a happy note. Maybe the happy note is we're going to get out a little early. Okay. This is where we're at. Okay. And we've been through a lot, folks. Okay, I mean, we spent the first part talking about the land and what I believe are good reasons why Israel should has right to the land from a biblical, a historical, and a legal setting. They have the right to the land. Then we started talking about the history of anti-Semitism starting earlier this month. We've talked about the early church fathers, looked at them, great group of guys, right? They love the Jews. Yeah, right. Okay. We talked about the reformers tonight. Okay. And next week, we're going to talk about modern day anti Semitism, what's been happening. And again, I'm skipping vast periods of time to get us to get through this material. So we'll talk about modern anti-Semitism. We'll talk about what led up to the Holocaust, and then we'll talk about what took place after the Holocaust, after the end of World War II, and we'll bring it up to what's going on in the world right now. The anti-Semitism that's not just happening over in the Middle East. It's not just happening in Europe. It's rampant here in this country. It's rampant here in this country. Okay. And, I'll show you some examples. Maybe you've got some that you might want to bring up, but we'll talk about modern day anti-Semitism. And then we'll kind of wrap it up with, what we need to be doing. And I said this last week, and I'm not just trying to blow smoke here or anything, but, I really appreciate you folks spending this time in this class. Okay. This isn't the easiest thing to sit through. I understand that. This is a difficult subject to teach. It's a difficult subject to research. I mean, you're getting about, 25% of what I'm studying. And yet you're sitting through this. And, it's not because you don't have something better you could be doing. But I hope it's the Lord trying to impress upon you that we need to be aware of what's going on, what has gone on from the time of the end of the apostolic age to what we're going to be talking about in a couple weeks. What's happening in this country right now. So I really appreciate you folks being here and sitting through this stuff. Yes, sir.
Why did you call the class short takes?
Because I knew if I called it long takes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned replacement theology a lot.
Yeah.
And you think that everywhere that you find replacement theology, that it's because of anti-Semitism, or everyone, I'll say it another way, everyone that holds to replacement theology, you think they're
Anti-Semitic?
Yeah.
No, I don't. I think, I've insulted enough people in my teaching. What's a few more? But when I start putting names up on the board, I think you're going to be very surprised at major theologians, major pastors that hold to a lot of replacement theology teaching. Okay, doesn't make them anti-Semitic, but it's only one step from replacement theology, I think. I mean, what do you do with the Jews if you're teaching? If you actually believe in replacement theology that the church now replaces the Jews, what do you do with the Jews? See, up until recently, the way you handle the Jews has said that they should all die. They should all die. Okay. But, we now have maybe we have a more kinder, gentler replacement theology. I don't know what they want to do with the Jews. All I know is that when I read some of these theologians, They have no respect whatsoever for the nation of Israel or what's going on. They think they're invaders. They use the same terms that are being used on the campuses right now. Okay, that's how it's going around. Okay, that's the spin that's going around. Okay, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the church today and how it's responding to what's going on in theological circles. Okay, don't want to get too theological on you here. Well, we will have only 3 people in here next week. So, any other questions, comments?
Just like to make a comment about last week. I guess my education, I thought the Crusades was all about the Muslims in the Middle East. I did not realize that a lot of the Crusaders would wipe out Jewish settlements on the way to the Middle East. I'd never heard that before.
Yeah. Most people haven't. Most people, that was, after last week's class, almost per person that came up said, I can't believe I've never heard this. Now I'm looking at, let's be honest, I'm looking at senior adults here. Okay. Until I studied this, I never understood the impact that the Crusaders had on the Jewish population at that time. But it was devastating. It was devastating. I mean, they were wiping out villages totally on their way to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims. Okay. But anyways, that's why I'm teaching this, I think, is to kind of open our eyes a little bit. Anything else?
I did have a question, and I'm still trying to kind of complete the bridge on these leaders that were supposedly very intelligent. How did they interpret the book of Revelation? The same book we have, obviously they had a text of that. And so did they just I don't believe in this, or did they just interpret it a different way? Because obviously the interpretation that I get from it is a lot different than these people that obviously are a lot more intelligent than I am.
Right. Let me talk about the 2 biggies, okay? Luther, when he translated, now one of the things that Luther did is he translated the Bible into German. And he didn't use the Latin text. He used the Greek and the Hebrew. Well, he used the Greek for the New Testament. When he translated the New Testament, he took the book of Revelation and the book of James. I'm trying to think. There might be another one. Might be Hebrews, and he put them in an appendix. They were not part of his canon. Okay, that was separate. He didn't include it in his Bible. It was part of the printing, but it was something that was like, nothing to see here, folks. Just move along, okay? That's how he handled
These aren't
it.
the droids you're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Calvin, from what I understand, did commentaries on just about every book in the Bible except Revelation. He did not do Revelation. Okay. So that's how the intelligentsia handled Revelation during the time of the Reformation. Okay. So something to think about, huh? Well, there, my time's gone, folks. Okay. Let me go ahead and close in a word of prayer, and then we'll get out of here. Next week, we'll move into somewhat modern times and take a look at what's going on here, and then we'll wrap it up. Let's pray. Father, thank you for